Someone told you that you were too much. Maybe they said it with words. Maybe they said it with silence. The particular silence that follows when you express something with your full intensity, and the room goes quiet, and you read that quiet as a verdict. Maybe they said it with the slow withdrawal of a person who was present for the contained version of you, and then disappeared when the actual version arrived. However it was delivered, you received it. And at some point, probably early, probably before you had the language to examine it, you made a decision, not consciously, not the way adults make decisions after deliberation, the way children make decisions when survival is at stake. You decided to get smaller. You learned to monitor yourself before speaking, to check the temperature of the room before expressing an opinion, to pre-censor the thought that was too large, the feeling that was too vivid, the reaction that was too immediate. You learned to offer only the version of yourself that fit the space available, and to quietly, invisibly, systematically eliminate everything that exceeded it. And the cruelest part is that you got very good at it. So good that, after years of practice, you stopped knowing which parts of you were being suppressed and which parts were actually you. The shrinking became indistinguishable from the self. Carl Jung spent decades studying this exact process, the mechanisms by which authentic human beings reduce themselves to what their environments require. He had a name for the constructed, reduced self that emerges from this process, the persona. And he had a name for everything that was driven underground by it, the shadow. And he spent his entire career insisting on something that most people who learn to shrink themselves have never fully believed. You were never too much. You were exactly as much as you were supposed to be. And every person, every environment, every system that told you otherwise was not describing a flaw in your construction. It was describing a flaw in its own capacity to contain something real. This is not a comfort statement. This is a clinical observation, one that Jung made across decades of sitting with people who had spent their lives successfully small, and watching what happened when they finally stopped. Before we go further, stop this video right now and write one thing in the comments. Think of the version of yourself you most reliably shrink before entering a room, the part you turn down before speaking, the quality you learn to make smaller because someone, somewhere, indicated it was too large for them. Just write, "I shrink my blank." One word or one phrase. Because what you write there is not a flaw. It's the thing this video is actually about, and it needs to be named before it can be reclaimed. To understand why the shrinking happens, you have to go back to a time before the decision was made. Jung's model of psychological development begins with the observation that every human being arrives in the world as a totality, not partial, not already edited, complete. A full-spectrum human being carrying the entire range of what human beings are capable of feeling, expressing, wanting, and being. This totality is not always convenient for the environments we're born into. Every family, every community, every culture operates on implicit rules about which expressions of human experience are acceptable and which are not. Some environments cannot hold anger. It's too threatening to the family's stability. Some cannot hold sensitivity. It challenges the mythology of toughness that holds the community together. Some cannot hold ambition, or grief, or sexuality, or wildness, or an exceptional degree of intelligence, or an exceptional degree of need. The rules vary. The mechanism is always the same. When a child expresses something that the environment cannot hold, the environment communicates this through punishment, through withdrawal, through the particular coldness that a child's nervous system reads as danger. And the child, whose entire biological mandate is to remain connected to the people who keep it alive, learns. It learns that this expression is not safe here, It learns that this part of itself must be managed, reduced, or hidden in order to maintain the connection that it needs to survive. Jung called this the formation of the shadow. Not evil, not pathology, simply the accumulation of everything real about a person that their environment designated as unacceptable. The anger that was punished, the grief that was called self-pity, the intensity that was called dramatic, the need that was called needy, the joy that was called showing off. Every piece of you that was ever met with that particular devastating sentence, "You're too much," became shadow material, alive but underground, present but invisible, real but inadmissible, and above the surface, carefully constructed, continuously maintained, the persona took shape. The version of you that learned what was welcome, the you that fit, the you that found the size that didn't threaten anyone, the you that was accepted because you had made yourself small enough to be acceptable. Here is what Jung observed about what it costs to maintain that construction. The energy required to keep the shadow suppressed, to maintain the gap between the totality of who you are and the reduced version you present, is not negligible. It is, in fact, enormous. And it is continuous. There is no rest from it. The suppression must operate at all times, in every interaction, before every communication, in every quiet moment when the real self tries to surface and must be managed back down. This is why people who have spent years shrinking themselves often feel a specific kind of exhaustion that sleep does not cure. Not physical tiredness, psychic depletion, the depletion of someone who has been running a concealment operation for so long that they have forgotten there was ever anything to conceal. Jung also observed what happens to the material that is suppressed. It does not become less real. It does not lose its force. It simply changes location from conscious expression to unconscious pressure. And from the unconscious, it continues to exert itself in ways that are harder to observe and much harder to manage. It exerts itself through the intensity of your reaction to people who express freely what you have been forced to suppress. You've been told your anger is too much, so you've suppressed your anger. And now you find yourself disproportionately triggered by people who are unapologetically angry. You've learned that your ambition is threatening, so you've diminished your ambition. And now you find yourself either deeply attracted to or inexplicably resentful of ambitious people. Jung called this mechanism projection. The shadow material that you cannot acknowledge in yourself gets seen with unusual intensity in others. The quality you judge most harshly in other people is almost always the quality you have most severely suppressed in yourself. This is not a metaphor. It is a clinical observation, documented across thousands of cases, consistent across every personality type, every culture, every historical period that Jung studied. The part of you that was told it was too much did not disappear. It went underground, and it is still there, exerting pressure, shaping your reactions, driving behaviors you cannot always explain, waiting. There is another dimension to the shadow that Jung found consistently in people who had learned to shrink themselves, and it is one that is almost never discussed in the popular psychology conversation about this topic. The shadow does not only contain what was suppressed by direct rejection, it contains what was suppressed by comparison. You did not only learn that you were too much from people who told you directly, you learned it from watching what was celebrated in others. The sibling who was praised for their quietness, the classmate who was admired for their composure, the colleague who advanced because they never took up too much room, the cultural model of the acceptable person, restrained, measured, contained, whose image was held up implicitly as the standard against which you were found excessive. Jung called this the collective shadow, the culturally agreed upon designation of which human qualities belong in the light and which must remain hidden. Every culture has one. Every era has one. And every person who grows up inside a culture absorbs its designations without necessarily being able to identify them, because they arrive not as explicit instructions but as the ambient air of what is praised and what is passed over in silence. In many cultural contexts, emotional intensity is a collective shadow quality. The person who feels deeply and expresses directly violates an implicit contract about emotional management that the group has agreed upon without ever formally discussing it. The violation is punished not because the feeling is wrong, but because it disrupts the shared regulation strategy. This means that many people who were told they were too much were not receiving a personal verdict. They were receiving a collective one. They were being informed that their natural expression exceeded the regulation norms of their specific cultural context, a context that was itself not neutral, but shaped by its own collective wounds, its own suppressed history, its own accumulated shadow. Understanding this dimension of the too much verdict is important because it changes the question. The question is no longer only, what did the people in my life not have the capacity to hold? It becomes, what has my entire cultural context been systematically unable to hold, and how has that systemic limitation been delivered to me as a personal flaw? Jung's answer to that question was consistent across his decades of clinical work. The qualities most consistently suppressed, by individuals and by cultures, are the qualities that are most threatening to the status quo. Not the qualities that are genuinely dangerous, the qualities that are genuinely alive. Intensity, honesty, depth of feeling, refusal to pretend, the insistence on meeting reality as it actually is rather than as agreed upon performance would have it appear. If you are someone whose natural expression tends toward intensity, honesty, and depth, if your factory setting is more rather than less, louder rather than quieter, realer rather than more polished, then you did not exceed some universal standard of appropriate humanness. You exceeded a locally agreed upon suppression norm, and that is an entirely different thing. Now here is where Jung's analysis becomes most important and most uncomfortable. The message that you were too much was never objective. It was never a measurement. It was never an assessment of your actual size relative to some fixed standard of appropriate human expression. It was a projection. The people who told you that you were too much were, in almost every case, people who had suppressed in themselves the same quality they found excessive in you. The parent who couldn't tolerate your anger had buried their own anger so completely that its appearance in you felt like a threat to the entire suppression system they had maintained for decades. The partner who asked you to be less intense had learned to associate intensity with danger and was not describing your intensity. They were describing their own unintegrated fear of their own. The teacher who rewarded your quieter classmates was not rewarding a more appropriate expression of intelligence. They were rewarding the expression that disturbed their own regulated environment the least. The friends who drifted away when your full personality appeared were not rejecting who you actually are. They were seeking company that didn't challenge the management of their own shadows by comparison. Jung was precise about this. The verdict, "You are too much," is never delivered by someone who has integrated their own shadow. It is always delivered by someone whose own suppressed material finds your unsuppressed material intolerable, because your freedom to be what you are is an implicit rebuke of their decades of self-reduction. This does not make them villains. It makes them wounded. They too were told they were too much somewhere. They too made the decision to shrink, and your refusal to shrink, or your attempt to stop shrinking, confronts them with a choice they are not yet ready to make. Understanding this does not mean forgiving everything or dismissing the real damage those messages caused. It means recognizing that the verdict was never about you. You were not measured against a reality. You were measured against someone else's wound, and the wound looked at you and called you too large. The question becomes, what happens now? Jung's framework for what happens when a person stops shrinking is called shadow integration, the gradual process of acknowledging, examining, and re-owning the parts of the self that were driven underground by the requirements of belonging. Shadow integration is not simple. It is not a matter of deciding to express yourself more fully and then doing it. The material that has been suppressed for years or decades does not surface cleanly or comfortably. It surfaces the way any long-suppressed reality surfaces, with a force that is proportional to the duration of the suppression. The anger that was never allowed to exist comes back initially, as more anger than the present situation seems to warrant. The grief that was called self-pity returns as something that doesn't seem to know when to stop. The intensity that was called dramatic arrives with an urgency that can feel, to the person experiencing it, genuinely alarming. Jung called this eruption the return of the repressed, and he was clear that it was not a sign of pathology. It was a sign of the system recalibrating. The initial excess is not the endpoint. It is the decompression of something that has been under enormous pressure for a very long time. Once that pressure equalizes, the expression normalizes. But most people who begin this process abandon it at the eruption phase because the eruption looks like evidence that the original verdict was correct. See, I really am too much. Look at what happened when I stopped managing myself. Jung's response to this would have been direct. What you are experiencing is not proof that you were too much. It is proof that you have been too small for too long. The eruption is not your natural size. It is the rebound from years of compression. And if you stay with it, if you neither force it back underground nor mistake the eruption for the destination, it will settle into something that is simply, genuinely, authentically yours. This settling is what Jung called the individuated self, not the persona, which was constructed by the environment's requirements, and not the shadow eruption, which is the persona's collapse, but the self that emerges when the suppression ends and the inflation calms. And what remains is what was always there. You, at your actual size, neither reduced nor inflated, simply present. There is something specific Jung observed about people who go through this process, about what changes when someone stops shrinking and begins to inhabit their full self. The first thing that changes is the quality of their exhaustion. The particular depletion of continuous self-management simply stops. Not immediately, not without the discomfort of the transition, but progressively. As the suppression is released, the energy that was maintaining it becomes available for other purposes. People who have spent decades tired in ways they couldn't explain discover that the tiredness was never constitutional. It was operational. It was the cost of running the suppression system. And when the suppression system is no longer needed, the energy returns. The second thing that changes is the nature of their relationships. This is more complicated because the relationships that were built on the reduced version of you are not necessarily equipped to hold the full version. Some people who have accepted you small will not accept you at your actual size. Some of the people you believed loved you will turn out to have loved the persona rather than the self it concealed. This is painful. Jung did not minimize it, but it is also clarifying. And the relationships that remain after the full self becomes visible, or that appear once it does, are fundamentally different in quality from anything the persona could attract. Because authenticity finds authenticity. The full self draws full contact, and full contact, the experience of being genuinely known and accepted rather than selectively seen, is, Jung believed, one of the deepest human needs. One that the shrunken self can never satisfy, no matter how successfully it performs. The third thing that changes is the experience of one's own interior life. The suppressed shadow, once integrated, stops creating the psychological static that characterizes the unintegrated psyche. The inexplicable irritability eases. The disproportionate reactions calm. The persistent sense of something wrong, something off, something not quite right about how you are living. That sense, which is the shadow's continuous attempt to signal its existence, quiets, not because the difficulty disappears, but because the conflict between what you are and what you are performing has been resolved. And that resolution, even partial, even ongoing, produces a quality of interior peace that Jung considered among the most significant markers of genuine psychological development. Here is where this becomes most important for you specifically. The shrinking you have been doing is not proof that you are too much. It is proof that you were taught to believe you were too much. There is a difference between those two things that is, in Jung's clinical assessment, one of the most consequential distinctions a person can make about themselves. What you have been suppressing is not excess. It is not disorder. It is not the dangerous overflow of a self that cannot be safely contained. It is the rest of you. The parts that were inconvenient for the environments you moved through. The qualities that other people's wounds designated as too large. The authentic expressions that did not fit the space available in the rooms where you learned who you were allowed to be. Jung spent his career returning people to what they were before they were reduced. Not to something new. Not to a better, improved, transcended self. To the self that was always there. Full, specific, unrepeatable, before it was taught to apologize for its own existence. That self is not too much. That self is, in fact, exactly as much as is needed. And every single thing you suppressed in service of being acceptable, every emotion that was called dramatic, every thought that was called too intense, every need that was called too demanding, every expression of joy or grief or fury or tenderness that was met with the particular silence that said, "Not here, not like this, not you." All of it belongs to you. All of it is yours. All of it is real. And all of it is waiting, with the patience of something that has been waiting a very long time, for you to stop apologizing for it and simply, finally, let it be. You were never too much. You have always been exactly enough. The world that told you otherwise was simply not yet large enough to hold you. Before you go, I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer it in the comments right now. Think of someone in your life. It could be anyone, past or present, who made you feel like you needed to be smaller to be loved. You don't need to name them. Just write, "I know who." And then, beneath that, write one word. The part of yourself you are ready to stop shrinking. Because when you name it here, in this comment section, with other people who understand exactly what this costs, something shifts. Jung called it making the unconscious conscious. I call it the beginning of coming home. Write it. You've been quiet long enough.